Yep, amazingly, this little machine that changed the face of computing in the UK just turned 40 years old. For a lot of us, this was the first taste of computing at home, and this was probably the PlayStation or Xbox of the day, at least in the 1980s. The Sinclair Spectrum seemed to kind of die a death in around 1992, I would say, but I never thought I'd be here 30 years later and people are still making games for it. Recently, the Spectrum 40 event was held in Bescott Stadium in Warsaw. Let's check out the event as well as looking back through some old memories. One of the first things I went to were the sellers. Thankfully there were a good bunch of Sinclair Spectrum games for sale, and I came home with about 20 of them. Chronosoft were there and they sell brand new games for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, but I also picked up one for the Sinclair ZX81. I don't even have a ZX81. I had used a ZX81 before, but this was my first time trying to play a game on one. The ZX81's completely in black and white and it has no sound. It's also got an atrocious keyboard. However, plug in that 16K expansion pack and you'll be amazed what this little machine can do. There were a few sellers selling brand new parts for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. I refurbished my Spectrum with parts from ZX Renew in a previous episode. I'd say there were about 100 people there, but I think the event needed a bit more going on. Maybe you bring along your own ZX Spectrum, set it up, bring some games to swap, that kind of thing. Or maybe run the ZX Spectrum event alongside another retro event. The author of Ant Attack, Sandy White, was there. This is probably one of the earliest games that I remember on the Sinclair Spectrum, released in 1983 and maybe one of the first isometric games ever out on the system. What surprised me most was not the game, but how young he looks. I mean, the guy's got to be into his 50s, but he's in really great shape. He did a quick interview panel, unfortunately I didn't manage to grab much of it. For me though, the best part of the day was the presentation and Q&A session from the Oliver twins. These two guys made some of the best games of our childhood, namely the Dizzy series. I've got no idea who's Andrew and who's Philip out of these two. It's a bit like PJ and Duncan. Who's who? No one knows. You always see these guys together. They're basically the same person. But they did a really good job talking about the development of their games, and they brought along a bit of gaming history, a roll of wallpaper. This roll of wallpaper was used to draw out the map for the first Dizzy game. But after the presentation, they went on to a Q&A session, and I got to ask that all-important question. Yep, I got to ask them about the really expensive game helpline. 44 pence a minute. I think basically I asked, did they get any kickback from this? They explained they kept getting sent letters from kids asking how to get past certain puzzles in the game. Initially they started writing to them, but it just became too much. They put together a cheat sheet which one of the members of staff would send out to the kids. After a while they decided there might be a bit of money in this and decided to set up the helpline, splitting the profits between the publisher and the twins. This actually led on to a really cool story where one young kid wasn't allowed to use the phone to phone the Dizzy helpline, so he'd go downstairs at night, make the call and get the information. One time at night when he went downstairs to make the call, he found a family member collapsed. He called the ambulance and they were saved. So thanks to this 44 pence a minute, a family member lives on. So what did I come away with? Well, I got 3 copies of the new Crash magazine. I got the full price version of Solomon's Key, which I own already on, I think it's on a demo tape, but nice to have the full version. Bugaboo the Flea, which is a great little platformer on the Sinclair Spectrum. I got a copy of Gregory Loses His Clock. I do actually own this, but this was in slightly better condition, so I ended up picking it up. Operation Wolf, a great little conversion on the Sinclair Spectrum, better with a light gun though. Diddums, I seem to remember you have to put toys in a toy box. I don't know, it's probably 30 odd years since I played this. Airwolf is a great little game on the Sinclair Spectrum, really difficult though, very hard. Hard Cheese is a game I barely remember, but I do remember the name, so I picked it up. Canyon Warrior, I got this from Woolworths I think back in the day. A great little shooter, and I think it's got like a level designer as well, really good. And Arcadia, I do own this, but for some reason the guy on eBay who sold it to me sent me the Commodore 64 version, so it's nice to have the Spectrum version at last. And Streaker, I think you have to sort of look around and find your various articles of clothes in this one. Don't remember much about it, but it was a game we had back in the day. And Beachhead, one of the really early games I remember. I think you have to shoot tanks on a bridge or shoot boats or something like that. I don't know, it's a long time. Uridium, it's not that great on the Sinclair Spectrum, but it was a game I remember growing up. It was cheap, I picked it up. Deathstalker, this is a great little game on the Sinclair Spectrum. Really awesome music in this one. I think I might already own it, but this was in slightly better condition. Eagle's Nest is kind of like a one-player gauntlet. It is quite good though. Don't remember too much about it, but remember it being quite good. And Harrier Attack, I think I confused this with Tornado Low Level. but it was a name I remember, so I picked it up. I bought Planetoids. This is a great early Asteroids game on the Spectrum, and I also bought Planetoids, because I forgot I bought it a few moments earlier. Space Raiders was probably the first Space Invaders game I played on the Sinclair Spectrum, and this one was really good. I remember getting a lot of fun out of this one. And finally, the Ship of Doom. This was the very first game we had on our Sinclair ZX Spectrum. I think we bought it, or rather my brother bought it, because the cover looked interesting. Unfortunately, it was just a text adventure, with the only fun to be had typing increasingly vulgar words into the text parser. I also picked up a couple of new games. The first one I picked up was Egghead Goes to Town. I played this quite a lot of the show, it was really good, if a little bit difficult. And the second game I picked up was 49er for the ZX81. You do need the 16K expansion pack for this though. Will I ever get a ZX81? Who knows. But that was the Spectrum 40th birthday event. Maybe there'll be a 50th, I don't know, some of these people are getting on in years, including myself. But one good way to look back at the Sinclair Spectrum is to look at the magazine cover tapes. I primarily bought Crash magazine for myself and my brother got Your Sinclair. However, the first magazine I bought would have been Your Sinclair, and it would have been this June 1988 issue. And what a cover. I think back then I might have been on maybe 20 or 50 pence pocket money, so this was quite a big spend back in the day. But seeing the game screenshots in the magazine was kind of magical. But I've been gifted a job lot of cover tapes. These are essentially worthless though for the Sinclair Spectrum. I think they're probably worth maybe 20 pence each, but it's all about the memories. So there's a bunch of cover tapes here, some from Crash magazine, some from Your Sinclair, and there's some from Sinclair User as well. So let's take a look back at some of these that made an impression back in the day. One of the most memorable cover tapes for me would be this one from Sinclair User. This had the demo for Midnight Resistance on the front cover, and what a great game this was. It was just the 48K demo of the full game. It didn't matter if you had one of those newfangled Spectrum Plus 2 or Plus 3 machines, you still got the 48K version. But let's load up the demo and take a look. I eventually got this for my 10th birthday. I think it was in Electronics Boutique. But I played the hell out of this demo over and over and over again, and it lasts about a minute. But let's take a look at it with that fantastic 48K Sinclair Spectrum music. Yep, this is what we had to put up with before we got a new machine. It's basically a buzzer, and it's amazing that it can make the sounds it does really. I remember when later computers and consoles came in, and their sound capabilities were so far ahead of the Sinclair Spectrum it was unreal. And then CD-based consoles like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, at that point it didn't really matter how capable the sound hardware was. It was a CD, you can make whatever music you like. The Your Sinclair 4-pack number 3 had a rolling demo of Shadow of the Beast. By this time I had seen it running on the Commodore Amiga, which was really impressive, so seeing this on the little 48K was a little bit of a letdown. However, in my opinion, all these years later, I think the Spectrum version plays a lot better than the Commodore Amiga version. Sure, it hasn't got the graphics, but it's so much more responsive. I'd also say it was a little bit more forgiving. But yeah, this was all the demo was, it was a rolling demo, you couldn't control it and it had no sound at all. But it was still a bit of a novelty seeing this little machine trying to play this big bad 16-bit game. And one thing you just do not get with emulation, the iconic poor RF signal quality. And the buzzing sound with the unshielded cables. I'll let you be the judge if you're nostalgic for that or not. One of Your Sinclair's magnificent 7 tapes had Star Raiders 2 on it. I briefly covered this in my last Starfighter episode, but this is the absolute classic game on the Sinclair Spectrum. It's got some great sounds, really cool explosions. I put hours and hours into this. This was a great cover tape. There was the Crash edition of Dizzy. This was just a bit of a cut down version of the full game we'd already played for years. I think it played pretty much the same, but I don't think you could get to the castle at the end. You had to buy the full game for that. Crash December 1990 gave us Technician Ted. I think my friend Paul had this and I really enjoyed it, so I was really happy to get this on a cover tape. Playing it again now, I completely forgot about the cool little loading screen where you get these little guys walking about. With a lot of games, you got a loading screen, if you were lucky. If you weren't, you got nothing. But let's listen to some awesome early Sinclair Spectrum music. The game itself has you try to complete a series of tasks. These are all fairly straightforward, however one thing that's not straightforward is the time limit. It's unbelievably tight, you'd have to play this game absolutely perfectly to even have a hope of making it. I just like to explore the different rooms though, that was enough for me. I'd say the January 1991 tape was also another one that was really popular. It had the exclusive game Dizzy 3.5. Fantasy World Dizzy had been out for a while on the Sinclair Spectrum, and we were looking for Dizzy's next adventure. This game acted as a bit of a prequel. The very last screen of the game is the first screen of Magic Land Dizzy. We couldn't wait for this game to come out. The hype was definitely real with this one. Despite all the stick it got, I really enjoyed the first Double Dragon game on the Sinclair system. Number 2 was absolutely rubbish, but I do remember playing the demo for Double Dragon 3. I thought this looked really good at the time. It was kind of late in the Sinclair's life where everything sort of went black and white to include as much detail as possible. I did give it a quick go now, and it is pretty rubbish. February 1991 and Crash Magazine gave us Trantor the Last Stormtrooper. I'd say this is probably one of the most graphically impressive Sinclair Spectrum games, at least for the time. The game's got an amazing loading screen that must have taken them ages to create this, and the game itself just looks absolutely incredible. For the time. It's really nice and colourful, great animation and loads of big sprites running around all over the place. Nowadays this won't impress at all, everyone's interested in ray tracing and stuff these days, 4K displays, but back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, this is where it's at. The first Magnificent 7 tape from your Sinclair gave us one great game, and one not so good but it's still memorable. Let's take a look at them both. The first game is Spin Dizzy, and this is a great little game on the Sinclair Spectrum. Guide your little spinning top through different rooms, over obstacles to collect gems. That's all there is to it, and it's a really great game. I only wish it would draw the screens a little bit faster, but can't have everything. Great game though, pick it up. The second game on the tape that I remember, it's not very good, it's HKM or Human Killing Machine. This is a poor Street Fighter ripoff, and I think it's made by the same team that made the conversion for the Sinclair Spectrum. They made the game engine for Street Fighter and they thought we can use this for another game. And they did, unfortunately. I did get a bit of fun out of this back in the day. I don't know how though, it's awful, it plays terrible, but I remember being really impressed by these background graphics, really impressive for the Sinclair Spectrum, even if they are only in black and white. Defeat the first guy, and then you have to fight his dog. Again, just like Street Fighter on the Sinclair Spectrum, duck and do the spin kick, it seems to be the only way to win. The demo of Nightbreed is always something I'll remember. I never actually owned the full game, but I really remember playing the demo quite a lot. I seem to remember it's quite a big demo as well, you could go to lots of different areas. However, the main reason I remember this game is back in the late 80s or early 90s, my parents had just been to my parents' evening at school. I didn't go this time, they just went on their own. They came back home and I was playing this on the big TV downstairs. I had an appalling parents' evening, I got an absolute bollocking and was playing this at the time and I got told to turn it off. Weird how things stick with you. And of course there was the Sinclair User 6 of the Best tapes. And this was my favourite one. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this had Solomon's Key on it. That was the game I picked up from the Spectrum 40th event, so really happy to pick that one up, but this is how I played it back in the day, it was on this tape. It's really good on the Sinclair Spectrum as well, nice and colourful. Place blocks, remove blocks, pick up keys, go to the exit. This is definitely one of those just one more go type games. So happy 40th birthday, I never thought I'd be playing this machine all these years later. It is perhaps the 48K Plus machine that I've got the most memories of. Trying to play games on those plastic keys, it kinda worked, don't try and type on it though. We absolutely wore this thing out. I don't know about you guys, but we always used OP, QA and space as the keys. Eventually the keyboard membrane could take no more. The keys were absolutely worn out and hardly worked. So you changed to other keys, K and L for left and right and S and X for up and down. Maybe the M key for fire. I think eventually we did get a new keyboard membrane, but it was not until this machine was absolutely on its last legs. But what a great machine, and it still looks modern today. So why collect all this old stuff? Why have it anymore? Why not just emulate everything? It's a bit like saying that to a record collector. It's all about the nostalgia, the cover art of the games, and for me particularly the graphics, the screenshots on the back of the boxes. It just truly takes you back to the past. I've got a lot of nostalgia for other systems, but the Sinclair Spectrum is always going to be number one to me. From those really early games like the horror series of games, to later games that were a bit more complex. I think game publishers back in the day, and even people that make games for the machine to this very day, are still squeezing out every last bit of power from this machine. You still see demos and games and you think, how can they make this little machine do that? But they do. But I guess it was just a bit of a simpler time. However, no matter how basic it was, there were no season passes, no microtransactions, XP boosters, armor unlocks, expansion packs, pre-order bonuses or monthly fees. It was just you and the game. Perhaps that's the way it should have stayed. If you're interested in a game these days, what's the first thing you do? Probably look at a presentation or something on YouTube. Maybe there's a downloadable demo you can get before the full game comes out, but make sure you order soon to get that pre-order bonus. But do you buy the basic, the special edition, or the deluxe edition? Sadly, that's where gaming has taken us. Carefully reading through Crash Magazine or Your Sinclair aged 8 or 9, looking at these screenshots, looking at what was to come, it was a really great time to be a gamer. It's pretty amazing the Sinclair Spectrum lasted as long as it did. There's even a competition here for a Super Nintendo, and they would have still been making Spectrum games. I think back in the day, at the time, I kinda thought the Sam Coupe would take over. This was by Miles Gordon technology, and it had the ability to play Spectrum games. It also had the ability to play its own library of games with much better graphics and much better sound. It never really caught on though, maybe technology was just moving a little bit too fast. But that's going to do me for this time. Leave some memories below, and happy birthday Sinclair Spectrum.